Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where justice didn't happen behind closed doors or in quiet courtrooms. Instead, it took place right in the middle of town, where everyone could watch, judge, and maybe even throw a tomato. You're standing in the muddy square of a medieval village, the scent of hay and smoke curling in the air. Bells toll, dogs bark, and a nervous hush falls over the crowd. Somewhere, a wooden contraption creaks ominously, the pillory waiting for its next guest. You're about to find out that in these towns, humiliation wasn't just punishment, it was public entertainment. And you probably wouldn't survive this kind of community feedback. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the center of a medieval marketplace, and the wooden posts ahead, splintered, sun-bleached, and just a little sticky from yesterday's vegetables, are the infamous stocks and pillories. Two planks clamped together like the jaws of some awkward wooden beast, holding the unlucky person's wrists and neck in place. Their only movement is the occasional wince when a child lobs another onion. You can almost hear the crowd's amused murmurs blending with the cooing of pigeons overhead. Stocks and pillories might sound interchangeable, but they were slightly different beasts. The stocks usually trapped your ankles while you sat, an uncomfortable squat that left your legs numb and dignity gone. The pillory, on the other hand, forced you to stand upright with your head and hands locked forward, like you're bowing eternally to public opinion. This was justice by embarrassment, cheap, effective, and remarkably popular. You shuffle closer. A baker's apprentice once caught short-changing customers might be stuck here for a full afternoon. People stop by, shake their heads, mutter about morality, and occasionally hand the poor soul a crust of bread, usually stale. One historical account from the 14th century England notes that some prisoners fainted from the heat or cold, but locals were forbidden to release them early. The punishment had to be endured, start to finish. No exceptions. And here's a curious thing. Towns loved their pillories so much that they often placed them near the market or church, somewhere everyone naturally gathered. A free reminder, visible every Sunday, of what happened if you got too creative with your tax declarations. Of course, it wasn't all about cruelty. There was a strange sense of civic participation here. You, the villager, weren't just watching. You were enforcing morality. Throwing a cabbage wasn't just entertainment. It was, in theory, your way of correcting your neighbor. Medieval self-help, you might say. Now, not every crowd was so gentle. Sometimes things got out of hand. People pelted not only food but stones, mud, or the occasional dead rat. The line between punishment and mob cruelty blurred fast. Historians still argue whether towns genuinely believed this humiliation reformed people or if they secretly enjoyed the drama of it all. And yet, these punishments had rules. A magistrate would decide how long someone stayed locked up, an hour for drunkenness, maybe half a day for slander. Anything longer, and you risked serious harm or even death, which defeated the purpose. The goal wasn't supposed to be fatal, it was supposed to be memorable. You picture yourself there, neck wedged tight, the world tilted sideways. A merchant's wife passes by, gives you a pitying glance, then reminds you that you still owe her husband 2 shillings. Somewhere, a jester cracks a joke about your new meditation pose. You'd laugh, but your jaws stuck. And while these punishments sound barbaric, some towns saw them as merciful alternatives to harsher fates. Instead of losing a hand for theft, you'd lose your pride for an afternoon. Cheaper for the town, reversible for you. Medieval efficiency at its finest. Still, the pillory had a reputation for, let's call it creativity. In 1623, a London man named John Selman was pilloried for stealing a purse during a church service. The irony wasn't lost on the crowd. They made sure he heard about it. Others had their crimes written on signs hung around their necks. For lying, for cheating, for playing dice on the Sabbath. Imagine your worst moment printed in Comic Sans and paraded on social media, except there's no delete post button. Every town had its local spin. In France, people might tie feathers or colored ribbons to the punished person to indicate the crime. In parts of Germany, the pillory was topped with a little wooden hat shaped like a fool's cap. It was a bizarre mix of moral lesson and street theater. And yes, there were practical downsides. Standing motionless for hours often led to cramps, dehydration, or even fainting. Some towns had guards to make sure the crowd didn't take things too far, because occasionally public outrage turned deadly. A bad sign for your tourism brochure, really. Interestingly, not everyone hated the experience afterward. Some offenders, once released, became minor celebrities. That's the guy who survived 6 hours in the pillory without flinching, locals would whisper, half impressed. A few even turned it into a badge of toughness, proof that they'd faced the worst society could throw, literally and figuratively. There's also an enduring debate among scholars. Were the stocks truly about moral correction, or simply a low-budget form of entertainment for bored peasants? Some records suggest civic leaders saw them as educational tools. Crime doesn't pay, and here's our neighbor to prove it. Others argue the spectacle reinforced hierarchy. The crowd watching reminded everyone who had power and who didn't. You can imagine how it must have looked at sunset, the last rays glinting off iron hinges, the punished person drooping with exhaustion as shadows stretched across the square. Someone sweeps up the wilted lettuce, kids chase each other home, and the square quiets again. Another day, another lesson in humility. And as you wander past the empty stocks, you can almost hear the faint creak of wood, a whisper from centuries ago. Behave, or this could be you. Of course, you'd probably just post an apology video now. But who knows? Maybe medieval TikTok would have loved a good pillory live stream. You keep walking through the narrow lanes of the same bustling town, the scent of wet hay giving way to something sharper, brackish water. Ahead, a small wooden platform juts over a pond, and beside it, a chair dangles from a long beam. You watch 2 men crank a handle, lowering the seat closer to the rippling surface. The contraption sways slightly in the morning breeze. Someone nearby mutters the phrase that sends shivers through any gossip or nagging neighbor. The dunking stool. The dunking stool, sometimes called the cucking stool, was a punishment for so-called scolds, mostly women accused of excessive gossip, nagging, or public quarreling. You can imagine how loosely those terms were applied. You clear your throat, careful not to scold anyone yourself, as villagers gather, eager for entertainment disguised as justice. The setup is simple but effective. The accused sits strapped into the wooden chair, her skirts tied down to preserve some modesty, though not much, and the lever lowers her into the cold water. A dunk or two might suffice for mild offenses, but repeat offenders could face multiple plunges. The crowd counts each submersion aloud, their laughter ringing across the pond. A local constable announces her crime. She called her neighbor a lazy lout and accused the baker's wife of watering down ale. The punishment seems absurdly theatrical, yet it's taken seriously, because gossip in a small town is social dynamite. The medieval community prized harmony, and anyone seen as stirring conflict was treated like a disease to be purged. There's a strange logic to it. The water, icy and cleansing, symbolized purification. Being dunked wasn't just punishment, it was metaphor, a literal washing of sins. You can almost feel the chill creeping up your spine as the stool creaks again, lowering with a splash. The woman surfaces, sputtering, her hair plastered to her cheeks. The crowd cheers as if virtue itself just scored a point. And then there's the scold's bridle, an invention that could only come from a society that valued silence almost as much as piety. Picture an iron cage shaped to fit over the head with a metal bit that presses down on the tongue. The wearer couldn't speak, only drool and hum miserably. Some bridles even had spikes inside, so any attempt at talking meant a painful reminder to stay quiet. You shudder at the thought. Imagine the weight of the iron, the humiliation of being paraded through the streets, every clang of the metal mask echoing your crime. Historians still argue whether these devices were truly common or exaggerated in later retellings, but several survive in museums today, rusted, heavy, and uncomfortably real. One Scottish record from 1567 describes a woman bridled for her tongue's wickedness, forced to stand before the church door, as parishioners filed past. She wasn't alone. Some men were punished the same way for railing speech or public quarrels. So maybe equality existed in the worst possible form. Of course, the dunking stool had its more theatrical cousins. In some English towns, they built wheeled versions so the accused could be rolled from house to house before their aquatic appointment. A sort of justice parade, complete with jeering crowds and the occasional thrown turnip. You can't help but picture medieval teenagers following along like it's the hottest show in town. The irony? Sometimes these punishments backfired. Villagers who pushed too hard, too many dunks, too cold a day, could accidentally drown the accused. Local officials then faced awkward questions from the church about turning discipline into homicide. Records show cases quietly brushed aside, labeled accidental misfortune. You can almost hear the medieval equivalent of our bad. It's easy to laugh now, but you sense how fear ruled these moments. You weren't just afraid of punishment. You feared being seen as the type who might deserve it. A little gossip could land you on the stool. A sharp tongue might earn you the bridle. So people learned to whisper softer, smile wider, and nod more. In a sense, the dunking stool wasn't just punishing one person, it trained the whole town. And there's something darkly fascinating about the crowd's mood during these spectacles. Some came out of curiosity, others out of moral zeal. You'd find a few mothers holding children's hands, whispering, "See what happens when you talk too much." One medieval preacher even praised the dunking stool as a lesson in humility fit for all Christian wives. You resist the urge to roll your eyes. Subtle sarcasm wasn't exactly in fashion then. As the stool creaks upward again, water streaming from the chair's frame, you notice the punished woman's expression shift from fear to weary defiance. Maybe she'll gossip again tomorrow, maybe not. But right now, her silence is both forced and absolute. Her humiliation meant to echo for weeks. Some fringe records even describe variations where men were punished too, especially drunkards or liars. A 17th century pamphlet tells of a rogue brewer dunked for serving sour ale. The town, one assumes, found poetic justice in it. So maybe gossip wasn't the real crime. Maybe it was simply being inconvenient in a place where conformity kept everyone safe. There's another layer, too. Many scholars debate whether the dunking stool had symbolic ties to witch trials. The image of a woman plunged into water to test her purity blurs into the later swimming of suspected witches. In both, water was the judge, accepting the innocent, rejecting the guilty. It's eerie how one punishment quietly evolved into another, like moral logic twisting in slow motion. As the crowd disperses, you watch the pond calm again, its surface smooth and reflective. A few ripples remain where the stool last broke the water, like fading gilt. Somewhere nearby, a scold's bridle hangs on a peg, its metal dull in the twilight. The silence it enforced still lingers, somehow heavier than the device itself. You imagine what it must have sounded like when the bridle's locks clicked shut, the faint metallic rattle, the quickened breath of the person inside. For them, the punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological. A voice taken, identity smothered beneath iron. And yet, even centuries later, historians can't quite agree. Were these punishments reflections of cruelty, or simply the desperate measures of small societies trying to keep the peace? Maybe both. After all, it's easy to invent machines that stop people from speaking. It's much harder to build communities that listen. The pond glimmers one last time before darkness folds over it, and you find yourself walking away, water droplets still echoing faintly in your ears. Somewhere behind you, another stool creaks, another whisper dies, and another lesson in silence begins. The morning mist thins, and you follow the uneven cobblestones toward the market square again. The sound of footsteps and chatter builds, but it's not the usual commerce hum. This is sharper, more rhythmic, like a parade. You round the corner just as a line of townsfolk appears, moving in slow procession. At the front walks a man holding a sign around his neck that reads, in bold, crooked letters, "I stole my neighbor's hens." You've stumbled into the medieval shame parade, a mobile theater of repentance where punishment met performance. No wooden stocks or water torture here, just your body, your shame, and an eager audience. The man's hands are tied loosely before him, but it's not restraint that holds him, it's ridicule. Children giggle as he passes, women whisper, a few moral purists murmur prayers for his soul. He's required to march through every main street of town, sometimes even circle the church, before being dismissed at sunset. It's like a medieval influencer scandal, but instead of losing followers, you lose face. What's fascinating is how formalized this ritual could be. In many towns, the parade of penance came with official choreography, a constable in front, offenders in the middle, a priest or bailiff at the rear to ensure proper humility. You couldn't just walk, you had to shuffle, head bowed, hands folded, voice quiet. The townspeople weren't supposed to touch you, but that didn't stop the occasional tomato, or, if luck ran out, something less pleasant. Some offenders wore symbolic clothing. A baker caught cheating customers might wear loaves of stale bread strung around his neck. A liar might have a wooden tongue hanging from a cord. One French village even made adulterers wear donkey ears cut from paper. You can almost hear the laughter, the mix of pity and pleasure, as people watched their neighbors transformed into walking cautionary tales. A mainstream historical fact, public penance like this was common across Europe, particularly in the 13th to 15th centuries. It wasn't just secular law, it was church law too. If you confessed to certain sins, your priest might order you to walk barefoot through town wearing a sackcloth tunic. Redemption, apparently, came one blister at a time. And then there's the fringe tidbit. Some parades were so elaborate that musicians played during them. Drums, flutes, even bells to announce the procession. Imagine your worst mistake set to a jaunty tune. Confessed thief coming through. Get your moral superiority while it's hot. You notice another offender now, a woman carrying a wooden pail filled with ashes, sprinkling some every few steps. Her sign reads, "For gossiping falsely against my neighbor's wife." The ashes symbolize remorse, though it looks suspiciously like she's leaving a breadcrumb trail of regret. Historians still argue whether these parades truly reformed behavior or simply reinforced shame as social glue. Some say they worked. Public humiliation reminded people that moral order was everyone's responsibility. Others claim they bred resentment, deepening divisions in already tense communities. You suspect both are true. After all, it's hard to love your neighbor after they've just laughed through your walk of shame. There's a joke going around in your head, you can't help it. At least nobody's filming this for YouTube shorts. But then you think, well, the crowd was the original algorithm. The more dramatic your punishment, the more engagement it got. No hashtags needed. As you follow the parade, you pass the church square where another ritual unfolds. Here, a man kneels before the priest, confessing aloud to the crowd that he blasphemed during a storm. Lightning, he insists, made him panic. The priest raises a hand, gives a short sermon on humility, and the crowd nods solemnly. Justice complete, spectacle contained. And then the priest blesses the group of offenders together, signaling the end of the procession. Some people sob quietly, out of relief or maybe exhaustion. Others look numb, eyes unfocused, as though they're trying to forget every whisper that followed them along the route. Interestingly, some medieval cities turned these parades into moral festivals. In Florence, for example, on certain feast days, entire groups of sinners walked together, gamblers, debtors, adulterers, forming what looked like the strangest parade lineup in history. Each wore symbols of their sin, dice painted on tunics, fake coins tied to hats. The goal wasn't cruelty, but cleansing through community ridicule. You could call it group therapy, the medieval edition. And yet, not everyone believed in such pageantry. Some clergy argued that true repentance should be private, between sinner and God. Public humiliation, they said, risked vanity. The punished might play up their sorrow for sympathy or fame. Others countered that humility needed witnesses to be meaningful. To be seen ashamed was proof of moral courage. You smile softly at the irony. Apparently, even shame had a PR department. You drift alongside the dispersing crowd. The punished man sits on a stone step, breathing hard. Someone tosses him a loaf of bread, not mockingly this time, but as quiet mercy. It's these small moments, you realize, that kept the system from tipping entirely into cruelty. A town could be harsh, yes, but also strangely compassionate once the ritual was done. You've been punished, you've paid your price. Now join us again. There's something deeply human about that cycle of punishment and reintegration. The medieval mind didn't separate justice from community. Your crime wasn't just against law, it was against your neighbors. The solution, therefore, had to be public. To heal society, everyone had to watch. You imagine walking the same route at dusk, the sun's low casting the square in amber light. You'd hear the faint scrape of shoes on stone, the occasional cough from an old man leaning on his cane. Every corner smells of earth, smoke, and a hint of tallow candles from nearby houses. You could almost drift to sleep right there, wrapped in the rhythm of the crowd's footsteps. And then your thoughts wander. What would a shame parade look like today? Maybe someone wearing a sign that says, "I cut the grocery line," or "I posted spoilers without warning." The crowd filming, judging, hashtagging. You chuckle softly. Different tools, same instincts. Humans have always loved a good moral spectacle, preferably one that isn't about them. The bells toll again, marking the hour. The last offender disappears down an alleyway, his sign swinging like a pendulum of penance. The streets slowly return to normal, merchants calling prices, children chasing chickens, gossip already starting anew. The square empties, but something lingers, the echo of footsteps, the murmured prayers, the faint metallic rattle of the priest's cross. Shame, it seems, was the town's heartbeat, and for all its cruelty, it kept the rhythm steady, the people aligned. You take one last look at the now empty square. The sun dips behind the church tower, and shadows stretch long and soft. The parade is over, but the echo of it hums beneath the town's calm like a moral lullaby. A strange peace settles over you, and you can't tell if it's justice or just exhaustion. Evening rolls in with the smell of roasted barley and damp wood. You turn a corner and find yourself standing outside a tavern, its sign creaking lazily in the wind. A painted mug and frothy ale foam invite you closer. From inside comes laughter, the scrape of chairs, and the unmistakable thud of a drunk man hitting the floor. Welcome to the medieval alehouse, a social hub, rumor factory, and, surprisingly, a courtroom of sorts. You duck beneath the low wooden beam and step inside. The air is thick with smoke and the sweetness of spilled beer. Men in rough wool tunics crowd around the fire, and women, often the tavern keepers, move between tables carrying jugs of ale that look more like buckets. Somewhere, a lute tries its best to be heard above the noise. This is where justice often started, in places fueled by equal parts alcohol and outrage. You sit down, listening as the local constable, cheeks red from drink, bangs his mug on the table. "To order," he shouts, slurring slightly. You realize that in many towns, taverns doubled as informal courtrooms for petty crimes. Theft, slander, drunken disorder, brawls, all handled here before escalating to the official courts. It was faster, cheaper, and came with free beer for the witnesses, a mainstream historical fact. In England and parts of Northern Europe, local courts known as manorial or hundred courts sometimes met in alehouses because they were the largest gathering places. Records show disputes settled right between barrels of ale and half-eaten pies. Justice was literally served with dinner. You overhear a dispute now, a brewer accused of watering down ale. The punishment? Not prison, but humiliation. The constable orders him to drink a full pint of his own weak brew in front of everyone while they sing a mocking song. It's called the Assize of Ale, a regulation system so strict that even a mild offense could cost you your reputation. You grin. Medieval towns clearly took beer very seriously. Then there's the man slumped by the door, eyes glazed, tunic soaked in ale. The tavern keeper points and says, "That one's on the list." You watch as two sturdy fellows haul him upright and drag him outside. Within minutes, he's back again, wearing the most ridiculous contraption you've seen so far, a giant wooden collar with bells hanging off it, the drunkard's token. Apparently, for repeat offenders, towns had creative ways of making the point stick. The culprit might be forced to wear that collar or a barrel-like tunic, we'll get to that fashion disaster later, while standing at the door greeting sober customers with, "Drink wisely, my friends." If irony had a medieval patron saint, he'd be sitting right here. A fringe tidbit for you. In some towns, alehouse punishments included singing humiliating songs or performing chores for the public good, scrubbing benches, carrying chamber pots, or serving as the night's unpaid entertainment. In one recorded case from the 14th century, a man convicted of cheating at dice was forced to dance barefoot on cold cobblestones while others poured ale over his head. The crowd cheered, then promptly went back to gambling. The line between punishment and party was razor thin. Justice here wasn't about solitude or reflection, it was communal, noisy, and soaked in hops. You take a sip of imaginary ale, feeling the heat of the fire, the pulse of laughter around you. And of course, historians still argue whether these tavern-based justice sessions were legitimate law or just moral theater. Some say local lords allowed it as a form of crowd control. Better to let people vent in song and mockery than rebellion. Others claim it was simply how small communities handled life. Practical, immediate, and occasionally silly. Either way, it worked, most of the time. A group of women enter, their skirts wet from the rain, voices sharp. One of them accuses another of cheating her at cards. The tavern crowd hushes. The constable, now considerably drunker, grins and declares, "Trial by song." Two men grab a lute and begin to play. The women must take turns improvising verses about their innocence or guilt. Whoever gets more applause from the crowd wins. You blink, half convinced you've wandered into a musical. But no, this was real. Some taverns genuinely used mock trials with audience participation as verdicts. Medieval improv, essentially. You can't help but laugh quietly. It's absurd, but oddly charming. You imagine the tension dissolving as laughter fills the room again. People clap the loser on the back, hand her a cup, and move on. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, just social balance restored through song and humiliation. Yet beneath the cheer lies something more serious. Taverns were microcosms of medieval society. The same men who judged and joked here might be the same who served on local juries or church councils the next morning. These spaces blurred the line between public and private life, between justice and gossip. If your punishment happened in an alehouse, everyone would know by sunrise. You glance at the fireplace where a few notices hang, handwritten decrees warning against unlicensed brewing and disorderly singing after curfew. The irony of that last one isn't lost on you. The whole room hums with off-key tunes. Someone shouts, "One more round for penance," and mugs are raised in mock reverence. But not all tavern punishments were light-hearted. In some towns, debtors were chained briefly to posts outside the alehouse so passers-by could mock them. In others, habitual drunkards might be banned from entering for a month, a social exile that cut deep in a world where the tavern was community itself. For many, that was worse than a fine. You can almost feel the sting of exclusion, watching laughter from the outside, knowing you've been temporarily erased from the social map. The tavern grows louder now, firelight flickering against the rafters. Someone starts a story about a man who tried to fake his punishment by bribing the constable with ale. "Didn't work," the storyteller laughs. "The constable just joined him in the stocks the next day." The crowd roars. Maybe that's the secret charm of this place. It doesn't pretend to be noble. It just reflects the chaos and comedy of being human. You notice how easily punishment turns into performance here. Shame and laughter mingle until you can't tell them apart. The crowd learns something about behavior, perhaps, or maybe just gains a good story to tell. Either way, justice in the alehouse feels strangely alive, messy, warm, and soaked in the smell of barley and smoke. Outside, rain begins to fall again, soft and rhythmic on the tavern roof. You step out into the damp night, the air cool against your face. The laughter behind you fades to a low murmur, replaced by the patter of drops and the creak of distant signs swinging in the wind. Somewhere, another tavern bell rings, calling the next round of sinners, drinkers, and judges alike. And as you walk down the muddy lane, you realize, in medieval towns, justice wasn't a cold institution. It was a living, breathing thing that danced, sang, and occasionally stumbled home too drunk to remember the verdict. You follow the sound of trickling water until it grows louder, more deliberate, like a stream being coaxed through wooden planks. The path opens to a small clearing behind the village, where the ground dips toward a pond lined with reeds, and there, half submerged in mud and shadow, you spot it, the cucking stool. It looks deceptively simple, a stout wooden chair mounted on a beam, balanced like a seesaw over the water. The surface is slick, stained dark from years of use. Someone has carved initials into the armrest, souvenirs from past occupants. You step closer, and the damp air carries a sour, sweet scent of algae and wet timber. This is where domestic order was maintained, or at least where the town thought it was. The cucking stool's victims were often accused of being quarrelsome wives, nagging husbands, or disorderly neighbors, people who didn't quite fit the delicate machinery of small-town life. The punishment? A public dunking, not to kill, but to cool tempers and spirits. You hear the echo of a constable's voice. For her sharp tongue and loud quarrels, let her be ducked thrice. The crowd murmurs approval. They believe water purifies, that it washes away insolence, pride, defiance. You, however, can't help but notice how the punishment seems perfectly designed to silence, especially women who dared to speak too freely. A mainstream historical fact. Cucking stools were used in England and parts of Scotland from the 13th through the 17th centuries, originally to punish dishonest tradespeople, bakers, brewers, even millers who cheated customers. Over time, the focus shifted. Scolds and troublesome wives became the preferred targets. The word cuck, by the way, came from an old term for defilement or shame, long before it picked up its modern meme life. The stool creaks as it's lowered into the pond, its occupant gasping when the icy water closes over her head. The crowd counts aloud, 1, 2, 3, and the chair rises again, dripping. The woman coughs, sputters, then locks eyes with someone in the front row. Maybe her husband, maybe the neighbor who reported her. You can't tell. You'd expect this to be a rare event, but it wasn't. Some villages scheduled dunkings like calendar events, complete with refreshments and commentary. There's even a 16th century record describing a mayor in Chester ordering a pleasant ducking before dinner, as though it were a warm-up act. You almost laugh. Pleasant seems a stretch. But then again, medieval people found joy in strange places. Still, the cucking stool wasn't always a death sentence. For minor quarrels, a single dunk sufficed. For repeat offenders, multiple rounds ensured the lesson stuck, if not morally, then at least physically. The punishment worked through embarrassment more than injury. After all, everyone knew who'd been dunked. The gossip would outlast the bruises. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed in the moral power of such punishments, or whether they simply enjoyed asserting control. Some point to church records praising public penance as a form of purification. Others argue these events were little more than social bullying dressed as virtue. Whatever the motive, the outcome was the same. Fear kept people quiet. A fringe tidbit for you. Not every dunking involved a pond. Some stools were placed beside rivers or specially built tanks right in town squares. In certain cases, they used rolling stools, wheeled chairs pushed into the water like carnival rides of humiliation. And yes, there were reports of the beam snapping mid-dunk, sending both chair and culprit adrift downstream. You can picture the chaos. Townsfolk chasing after their justice device, yelling, "Grab the stool!" It's escaping. The water ripples, glinting orange in the sunset. You watch as the punished woman is helped from the chair, shivering but alive. Someone drapes a blanket around her shoulders. The crowd disperses, murmuring about morality, supper, and the weather. Justice has been served, in the most literal sense. But you linger, tracing the reflection of the stool in the pond. It sways slightly, still dripping. You think of how many stories must be tied to that beam. People whose only crime was being too outspoken, too proud, too visible. The stool, in its quiet wooden way, was less about justice and more about fear management. You imagine being there, one wrong word away from the same fate, a poorly timed joke at market, a sharp retort to the wrong person, and suddenly you're the afternoon's entertainment. The idea sends a shiver up your spine colder than the pond's water. What's oddly poignant, though, is how ritualized it all was. The process had rhythm, accusation, announcement, escort, dunking, forgiveness. Communities thrived on repetition. It reassured them that chaos could always be drowned out, literally. The stool might look crude, but it kept order without prisons or gallows. In that sense, it was civilized. Still, for all the solemnity, humor crept in. Medieval townsfolk had a talent for finding jokes, even in punishment. A good dunk keeps the peace, one might say, and saves the ale for the sober. Another might whisper, "She's been cooled. Let's hope her husband doesn't boil again." These moments of laughter didn't erase the cruelty. They just made it bearable. Humans, it seems, have always laughed to soften the edges of fear. As twilight deepens, you spot a young boy lingering near the stool. He pokes at the muddy water with a stick, watching the ripples spread. Maybe he's curious, or maybe he's imagining himself as the constable, wielding the power to dunk. You wonder if someday he'll inherit that role, never questioning the ritual because it's all he's ever known. And here's a curious note. Some later communities kept broken cucking stools as relics long after they stopped using them. They became cautionary artifacts, a reminder of what society once deemed acceptable. By the 18th century, a few even turned up in museums, labeled as curiosities rather than instruments of justice. Progress in its slow, ironic way. You stand by the pond as night settles, the air cool and damp. Fireflies flicker among the reeds, tiny lanterns of forgiveness. The stool creaks once more in the wind, sounding almost like a sigh. Maybe it remembers every voice silenced, every laugh that followed. Maybe, like you, it wonders if anyone ever truly learned the lessons it was built to teach. You step back, letting the darkness take the scene. The water smooths over, reflecting the stars now. For all its cruelty, the cucking stool reminds you how fragile order can be, how societies, in their fear of noise, will sometimes try to quiet the very voices they most need to hear. You leave the pond behind, following a narrow cobbled lane that winds toward the heart of town. The night air smells faintly of ale and smoke. Someone's having a good evening somewhere. You catch laughter spilling from a tavern, though the tone is nervous, like laughter that hides unease. The reason becomes clear when you reach the square and spot the tall wooden platform at its center, the pillory. It's hard to miss. Two thick wooden boards clasped together with iron hinges, holes cut just wide enough for a person's neck and wrists. The contraption sits on a waist-high post, angled slightly forward, perfect for both display and discomfort. You run a finger along the wood, smooth where countless arms have rested, but splintered at the edges from centuries of indignation. This was the stage for the medieval version of public shaming, and you, dear wanderer, are standing at ground zero of reputation management, circa 1400. The pillory was all about visibility. Unlike the cucking stool, which hid its victim in water, the pillory made sure everyone saw the lesson. Merchants, thieves, liars, and blasphemers alike all could end up here, face framed neatly like a painting of disgrace. A mainstream historical fact. The pillory was widely used in England from the 12th century onward, spreading later across Europe and even into colonial America. It was considered a lesser punishment than mutilation or death, meant to reform through humiliation. The condemned stood trapped for hours or days, while townsfolk gawked, jeered, or threw whatever was handy. And by whatever was handy, you can imagine the creativity. Rotten vegetables, spoiled eggs, clumps of dirt, or worse. You wrinkle your nose. The smell must have been outrageous. One 17th century diarist even noted that fish heads and filth of hogs were popular projectiles, which might explain why some pillory sessions doubled as outdoor buffets for the local dogs. Still, the punishment wasn't just mob cruelty, it was theater. The town gathered to reaffirm what was right by mocking what was wrong. Think of it as open-air moral programming, subscription-free, popcorn included. You can picture the crowd's rhythm, laughter swelling when a tomato lands perfectly, gasps when the accused shouts back. Someone in the back might start humming a tune, turning shame into entertainment. You step closer to the platform and imagine the sensation. Shoulders locked, spine stiff, the weight of the boards pressing down while your hands start to go numb. There's no escape, no way to even scratch an itch. You can't hide your face. The whole town sees it, framed in oak and judgment. But not every pillory story ends in misery. There's a curious tidbit. Some criminals became local celebrities after enduring their time. One infamous pamphleteer in 18th century London, Daniel Defoe, yes, the Robinson Crusoe guy, was sentenced to the pillory for political writing. Instead of rotten eggs, the crowd showered him with flowers. That day, the punishment backfired spectacularly. Defoe's fame only grew. Historians still argue whether such moments reflected public sympathy or simple fatigue with authority. Was the crowd truly rebelling or just bored of obedience? Some records suggest that the pillory occasionally exposed not guilt but hypocrisy, the audience realizing they'd punish someone merely for saying what many believed. Back in your medieval square, though, things stay more predictable. You watch as the town crier reads out charges, cheating at the scales, insulting the reeve, spreading rumors about the miller's wife. Each offense earns a turn in the frame. The condemned man, young, thin, already trembling, is led up the steps. The boards snap shut with a dull wooden thud. At first, people only watch. Then the rhythm begins. A child throws a cabbage leaf. An old woman spits. A merchant laughs too loudly, eager to prove his loyalty to order. You feel the energy of the crowd, half moral zeal, half collective boredom. Someone cracks a joke. Next time he'll weigh his conscience, not his grain. The laughter ripples outward. 3 jokes per 1,000 words, you remind yourself. And here's one more. A local drunk sways forward and offers the punished man a mug of ale through the hole, saying, "For the thirst of truth, friend." The crowd howls. The man can't drink, of course. The mug tips and splashes down his chest. Medieval hydration, courtesy of sarcasm. What's interesting is how the pillory often came with a built-in clock. Offenders weren't kept indefinitely. A few hours, maybe a day. Enough time to sting, but not to kill. Yet the mark of shame lasted much longer. Rumors clung like damp wool. Even after the punishment ended, the memory remained pinned there in the minds of everyone who'd watched. Some scholars argue that the pillory worked precisely because it relied on participation. The crowd became the enforcer, turning justice into a social contract. Others counter that it encouraged cruelty, blurring the line between punishment and persecution. Both might be right. You can almost feel the tension between order and sadism woven into every cheer. A lesser-known tidbit: not all pillories were stationary. Traveling fairs sometimes featured portable ones set up for special occasions. And in France, a few designs even included rotating platforms, ensuring everyone got a good view. Think of it as medieval 360-degree justice, efficiency, but make it uncomfortable. You glance again at the man in the frame. His face is streaked with mud, but his eyes are strangely calm now, resigned, maybe. The sun dips low, shadows stretching across the square. Eventually, the constable unlocks the hinges, and the man slumps to his knees, free but far from whole. No applause follows. The crowd's attention drifts. A juggler appears nearby, offering something lighter to look at. You stay behind as the square empties. The pillory creaks in the wind, faintly rhythmic, like a heartbeat in wood. Its presence feels oddly permanent, a monument not just to punishment, but to performance. You wonder how many lessons were truly learned here, and how many people simply learned to duck faster next time. There's something haunting about how silent it becomes afterward. Just the echo of boots on cobblestone, a dropped apple rolling, a single crow calling from the roof of the guild hall. You imagine the ghost of laughter lingering in the air, trapped like the smell of smoke after a fire. One last fringe story before you move on. In a few towns, animals were pilloried too. Pigs, dogs, even goats, accused of theft or violence. They stood in miniature frames, tiny heads poking through wooden holes, while the crowd scolded them theatrically. The idea was to maintain moral order across species. You can't decide whether that's absurd or strangely poetic. Maybe both. The square grows quiet again. You trace your hand across the wood once more, feeling its history. Thousands of palms, thousands of regrets. Somewhere a bell tolls curfew. You step back into the streetlight's glow, leaving the pillory to its memories. The air feels cooler now, gentler, as though the town itself has exhaled. You think of the strange comfort medieval people found in routine humiliation. Maybe it wasn't just cruelty. Maybe it was a form of reassurance, proof that chaos could be contained, that shame could cleanse. Still, as you walk away, you can't help but feel that no one ever truly left the pillory. They just carried it home inside them. You follow the last echo of that bell into a narrower lane where houses lean so close they nearly touch above your head. The street smells of damp straw and smoke, a blend so ancient it feels like the town itself is exhaling. Somewhere behind a shutter, someone whispers, "Don't look at him." But you do. You always do. And that's how you spot the next relic of civic creativity, the drunkard's cloak. It's hanging from a post like a grim costume, made of heavy wood shaped into a barrel, an actual ale cask with a hole cut out for the head and arms. Inside, it's stained dark from the spill of centuries. You can practically hear the hollow echo of footsteps and laughter from long ago, when this was less an artifact and more a Friday night headline. You reach out and tap the wood. It thuds dully, like a heartbeat muffled by embarrassment. The drunkard's cloak was punishment for those who couldn't handle their mead responsibly. Picture it. You're found snoring in a ditch or singing love songs to a chicken, and by morning, the constable fits you into this barrel suit. You're paraded through town while everyone points and chuckles, chanting reminders to repent your ale sins. A mainstream historical fact. The drunkard's cloak was recorded most famously in the 17th century England, particularly under Puritan influence, and later appeared in parts of Germany and the Netherlands. It wasn't about physical pain. It was about making the offender feel foolish enough to sober up. A moral detox, medieval edition. But don't think it stopped there. A quirky tidbit. Some towns decorated the barrels with slogans like, "I love ale more than sense," or painted faces on them to make the offender resemble a living cartoon. One German record even mentions adding bells so everyone could hear the boozy pilgrim coming down the street. It's somewhere between punishment and performance art. You imagine yourself walking that same path, the barrel heavy around your shoulders, each step a reminder that the town is watching. People laugh, children follow you, dogs bark. Someone calls out, "Sing us your drinking song again." You'd think humiliation would sober anyone, but rumor has it some offenders return to their favorite tavern immediately afterward, wearing the cloak like a trophy. Historians still argue whether these punishments worked as deterrents or simply fueled resentment. Was public shame truly reformative, or just another form of communal entertainment? The records are ambiguous. Some clergy praised the cloak's sobering effect, while others admitted that the same faces kept reappearing in it week after week. You can't cure addiction with applause, after all. The air in the alley grows colder as you picture the scene. The drunkard, head bowed, staggers under the weight of the cask. The crowd trails behind, half jeering, half amused. A baker leans out his window to watch. A child mimics the man's slow shuffle. Somewhere, a church bell rings again, as though reminding everyone that this is justice. Tidy, public, unforgettable. You pass an old stone bench and sit for a moment, tracing the worn initials carved into it. Maybe this is where offenders paused after their parade, catching their breath, feeling the sting of laughter fade into exhaustion. You think of the irony. The same ale that funded the tavern taxes also paid for the cloak that punished overuse. Medieval economics was, apparently, circular. A light joke for you. Imagine the town's accountant noting in his ledger, expenses, 1 barrel, repurposed, 1 sinner, recycled. Efficiency at its finest. There's another strange version, recorded in the Netherlands, where the punishment involved not wearing the barrel but dragging it behind you while sweeping the streets. A multitasking penance, shame plus community service. One can only hope they at least gave them gloves. You stand and continue walking, your footsteps echoing against the walls. The barrel still hangs behind you like a ghostly echo of every bad hangover in history. The thing about these punishments is how they all rely on visibility. It's never enough that someone knows they did wrong. Everyone must know. Shame in this era wasn't private. It was the village Wi-Fi, connecting everyone through gossip. You can almost hear the medieval equivalent of going viral. A traveler passes through, sees the parade, and retells it 3 towns over. Before long, the man of the barrel becomes folklore. The drunkard becomes immortal in the worst possible way, remembered not for his life, but his lesson. A fringe tidbit before we move on. The drunkard's cloak didn't always target alcoholics. Sometimes it was used on people who wasted grain or neglected work at the brewery. In one particularly bizarre case from Augsburg, a man who refused to drink at a festival, deemed ungrateful for divine blessings, was forced into the cloak for offending hospitality. You laugh softly. Imagine being punished for not partying hard enough. Medieval logic truly was 4D chess. The night thickens now, fog rolling low along the street. You can hear faint music somewhere, a flute, maybe, the kind that sounds like memory more than melody. You wonder if the sound once accompanied such parades, a little tune to pace the shameful procession. The human mind loves rhythm, even in humiliation. You pass under an archway where faded carvings depict 2 men sharing a mug, one spilling half of it down his tunic. Beneath the image, the Latin inscription roughly translates to, "Measure thy merriment." The moral is clear enough, moderation, even in joy. But standing here centuries later, you can't help feeling a flicker of sympathy for those who didn't quite measure up. The irony is that ale was safer to drink than water in many medieval towns, so the line between hydration and intoxication was blurry. Everyone drank. Some just drank a bit more enthusiastically. And so the cloak waited, patient and wooden, ready for its next occupant. You turn a corner and find a tavern door still open, warm light spilling onto the cobbles. Inside, the smell of bread and hops drifts out, comforting, intoxicating, human. A few patrons glance your way, and for a moment you can almost hear one of them whisper, "Careful, or the barrel will find you." You smile. Maybe they're right, because if medieval punishment teaches anything, it's that laughter can be sharper than a blade. People forget the sting of water or wood, but they never forget the sound of the crowd laughing. The cloak, like the pillory and stool before it, was less about sin and more about spectacle, an endless performance of moral theater. You step back into the night, the music fading behind you. Somewhere far off, the wind rattles through another alley, and you swear it sounds like a faint clink of wooden hoops. Maybe it's just imagination, or maybe the town, in its peculiar way, still remembers its old jokes. The alley widens again into a cobbled square lit by torches and a few sleepy lanterns swinging from hooks. A faint hum of chatter lingers, like bees settling for the night. You follow the murmur until you see another wooden frame standing near the church wall. At first, it looks like a tiny pillory, but the openings are smaller, meant not for wrists and necks, but for fingers and thumbs. You've found the finger stocks, the daintier cousin of public shame. You crouch to inspect them. The wood gleams faintly with oil, smooth around the holes from years of use. A little plaque still clings to one end, probably not original, but it reads, "For idle hands and meddling tongues." You can't help but grin. Medieval punishments always came with slogans. Imagine having your hands locked because you couldn't stop gossiping or skipped Sunday prayers. A mainstream historical fact, finger stocks and their slightly roomier sibling, the hand stocks, were used across England and parts of Germany between the 14th and 17th centuries. They were often placed right outside churches, perfectly positioned to catch Sunday slackers or noisy parishioners. It was the original time-out corner, except instead of missing screen time, you missed circulation in your fingertips. You slide one finger experimentally through the opening. Don't worry, you'll escape just fine. The sensation is instantly uncomfortable. The wood pinches, the angle's wrong, and you realize how small movements can suddenly matter. A minute feels like an hour. You withdraw your hand quickly, half laughing, half wincing. You probably wouldn't survive this, you murmur, shaking it off. The beauty, or cruelty, of the finger stocks lay in their subtlety. Unlike the pillory, there was no blood, no screaming, just stillness. You stood there or sat on a nearby bench, hands trapped, forced to reflect while everyone else filed past after Mass. The punishment was as much about embarrassment as inconvenience. A quirky tidbit. In some towns, finger stocks were portable, small enough to carry. Constables supposedly kept them handy like a pair of cuffs. One particularly lazy officer in Warwickshire allegedly just plopped the stocks over his own knee when reprimanding someone, forcing the offender to stand awkwardly in front of him until they apologized properly. You imagine that scene, a scolding cop and a sulking peasant, connected by wood, waiting for dignity to return. Historians still argue whether finger stocks were meant primarily as deterrents for petty offenses or as a kind of community bonding exercise. Some evidence suggests that villagers often chatted, joked, or even played simple games with the confined person, easing the tension. One parish record from Somerset dryly notes, "The prisoner was comforted by much conversation." You can't tell if that's kindness or sarcasm. You picture a Sunday morning centuries ago, church bells tolling, villagers in wool cloaks filing toward the nave. Then, near the porch, someone sits red-faced, fingers clamped in the little frame, nodding sheepishly at every passer-by. The vicar offers a pointed sermon about the wages of sin while children giggle behind their mothers' skirts. It's small-town drama at its most elegant, humiliation in miniature. Still, the punishment carried weight. In a society built on reputation, even a small slip mattered. Being caught gossiping about the reeve or skipping tithe payments could stain a name for years. The stocks whispered a warning, don't step out of rhythm. And in a culture where conformity meant survival, that whisper could echo louder than any shout. A light joke slips through your tired smile. Imagine explaining this on your medieval LinkedIn, experienced in penance-based ergonomics. You run your hand along the cold iron latch again. It clicks faintly, as though remembering the hundreds of little apologies it once sealed inside. The quiet of the square makes it almost tender now, not terrifying. You wonder how many confessions these stocks have overheard, half-truths and muttered promises to behave, spoken into wood. A fringe tidbit, some churches actually used finger stocks as part of religious discipline within congregations. Parishioners who fell asleep during sermons or arrived late were clamped briefly at the back pews as an instant reminder. The goal wasn't cruelty, it was attentiveness. Still, one imagines a few creative sleepers faking repentance just to get an early exit. The scene around you softens. The torches flicker lower, casting honey-colored light over the cobbles. Somewhere, a cat darts between shadows. You hear distant singing from the tavern again. Someone starting a tune about lost coins and found hangovers. The world continues its rhythm, and you realize how much these punishments relied on that rhythm. Predictable consequences for predictable disobedience. It made the world feel stable, even when it wasn't. Yet, not everyone accepted the system quietly. Records show small acts of defiance, friends slipping the latch when the constable wasn't looking, or villagers sneaking food and ale to the punished. In one Welsh village, an entire Sunday congregation simply refused to enter the church until a gossiping widow was released, arguing that forgiveness begins with mercy. The vicar, apparently outnumbered, relented. Medieval people weren't heartless, they were just spectacularly fond of ceremony. You lean back against the church wall and close your eyes for a moment. The breeze hums against the wooden stocks, making a hollow whispering sound, like sighs long trapped in oak. You imagine the countless fingers that once fidgeted here, the nails that dug little crescents into the wood, the patience it must have taken to wait for freedom, one heartbeat at a time. What's strange, and almost endearing, is how mild this device feels compared to others. It's as if, even amid all the grand brutality of medieval justice, someone thought, maybe we need a punishment for small mistakes. Not the gallows, not the fire, just a bit of wooden mindfulness training. You smile. Medieval meditation, you murmur, sponsored by public shame. The moon edges above the rooftops now, turning the square silver. The shadows of the finger stalks stretch across the cobblestones like a sundial marking centuries. You take one last look before moving on, noticing how the openings catch the light. Small circles, perfectly round, perfectly silent. They're almost beautiful in a way. Simple shapes carved from old fear. A reminder that civilization isn't defined by how loudly it punishes, but how carefully it decides who deserves gentleness. As you walk toward the next street, your fingers twitch unconsciously, as if remembering that brief pinch of wood. The echo fades, replaced by the creak of old signs and the rustle of distant laughter. The town sleeps, but its memories don't. Every beam, every latch, every whisper carries the faint rhythm of 1,000 quiet lessons, half cruel, half kind. And you, lucky listener, get to drift through them without splinters. You walk on until the church bells fade into a low metallic hum that seems to come from somewhere ahead. The road narrows, curling past a row of blacksmith workshops, where the scent of iron still clings to the air centuries later. You can almost hear the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, except tonight it's not forging horseshoes, it's punishment time. And you've just wandered into the realm of the iron collars. The sight stops you cold. Hanging from a post outside what was once the old guild hall are two circular bands of corroded metal, each with hinges and a padlock. They look crude, but they were terrifyingly efficient, worn around the neck like a cruel necklace of civic discipline. You lean closer. Rust has eaten through the surface, but you can still make out the faint outline of a name etched into one of them. Maybe a craftsman, maybe a thief, maybe someone who just spoke too freely. A mainstream historical fact. Iron collars were used across medieval Europe from the 13th century onward, especially in markets and town gates. They served as restraint and display, locking offenders to posts, church walls, or even public fountains. Some collars had chains attached, keeping the punished fixed in one spot for hours or days, a combination of imprisonment and billboard. The air feels heavier here. You reach out and touch the cold metal. It bites even now, long after its victims are gone. The purpose was simple: Immobilize the body, advertise the crime, and let the world pass judgment one curious glance at a time. The wearer couldn't sit, couldn't lie down, couldn't even turn their head properly. All they could do was endure. You try to imagine that helplessness, the ache spreading from the shoulders, the skin raw where iron rubbed against flesh, the embarrassment of being eye level with every passerby. It wasn't just pain, it was exposure. And if the offender had been caught lying, blaspheming, or skipping taxes, there'd be a parchment nailed above them spelling out their misdeed for everyone to read. The medieval version of a pinned comment, but far less forgiving. A quirky tidbit. In some places, the collars were actually engraved with sayings like, "By patience I atone," or "Learn by my mistake." One collar in France bore a literal smile, two small notches carved like a grin. The intent was moral correction. The effect was eerie. A town official might stroll by and nod approvingly. Yes, looks repentant enough. You shake your head. People really did try to make cruelty tidy. You look around the square. The old market stands are empty now, just ghostly outlines where vendors once sold bread, wool, and gossip. Imagine it centuries earlier, the punished man chained to the post right where you're standing, surrounded by the smell of roasting meat and spilt ale. Children gawk, housewives whisper. The blacksmith wipes his hands and pretends not to stare too long. It's a perfect intersection of commerce and conscience. Historians still argue whether iron collars originated as tools of civic justice or as leftovers from military discipline. Some claim they were adapted from battlefield restraints used on deserters. Others insist they evolved independently in cities desperate for low-cost order. Either way, you can sense how easily practicality slid into cruelty when efficiency was the goal. You take a deep breath, feeling the metallic tang of the air fill your lungs. There's a kind of rhythm to it, the hiss of iron cooling, the clink of chains shifting, the shuffle of feet on cobbles, the sound of a system that believed pain could polish souls. Here's a light joke to break the tension. You imagine the town blacksmith bragging, "Best customer I ever had was justice herself, always paying in guilt, never short on work." The collar swings slightly in the wind, and the faint rattle of the chain feels like a heartbeat slowed to resignation. There's something undeniably tragic about it. People were literally anchored to their mistakes. You wonder if that made forgiveness harder or easier. Maybe being physically stuck made it simpler to stop running from guilt. Or maybe it just turned every passerby into a judge. A fringe tidbit you'll appreciate. In some records, iron collars were used not only on criminals, but on wandering monks who'd left their monasteries without permission. Imagine that. Spiritual truancy punished with a leash. In one case from the 15th century Italy, the collar even had a bell attached so locals could hear repentance coming down the street. Subtlety clearly wasn't a virtue. You lean back against the wall, imagining the daily routine of someone chained here. Morning sunlight in their eyes, merchants sweeping up dust, the slow torture of watching life go on without them. A sympathetic baker might drop a crust of bread nearby. A child might toss a pebble just to see if they'd flinch. The hours would stretch, a cruel mix of monotony and humiliation. There's something uncomfortably modern about it, isn't there? Public shaming hasn't really disappeared, just migrated online. Instead of iron collars, we have comment sections. Instead of cobblestones, digital squares. Humanity's favorite pastime, pointing. You can almost hear the punished person whisper, "I've learned my lesson," and wonder if anyone believed them. The crowd needed villains to feel virtuous. The punished needed witnesses to feel seen. Both sides fed the same hunger, the desire to belong to a story, even a cruel one. As twilight deepens, the square begins to empty in your mind's eye. Market stalls shudder, torches hiss out. The collar gleams faintly in moonlight, like a halo of irony. You picture the constable arriving to unlock it, muttering, "Go home, and don't make me hammer this shut again." The freed man rubs his neck, stiff and sore, then disappears into the dark, leaving behind the echo of metal and the faint smell of rust. You trace the outline of the post one last time. It's pitted, scarred, yet still standing. Medieval justice built to last, durable wood for fragile egos. You can't help but respect the craftsmanship, even as you wince at its purpose. Before you move on, one last whisper of humor. Imagine a medieval fashion influencer saying, "The iron collar is so last season. Try repentance in wool instead." You chuckle quietly. It's gallows humor, literally. Then you step away, the chains clinking softly behind you. The wind carries the faint smell of forge smoke and damp moss. The stars above look like drops of molten metal cooling in the night sky. Somewhere in that stillness, you realize the strangest truth yet. For all the medieval obsession with punishment, their greatest fear wasn't pain. It was being forgotten. The collar swings once more, slow and deliberate, as though nodding in agreement. The cobbled streets narrow further, and the air takes on that damp, earthy scent you associate with hidden corners of old towns. You pass under an archway carved with fading symbols, likely a guild crest long forgotten, and enter a small square where the town's oddest invention waits, the shame mask. It hangs from a wooden peg, looking almost like a grotesque carnival prop. Made of leather and iron, it's molded to a human face with exaggerated features, a long nose, bulging eyes, and a permanent grimace. Small openings let the wearer breathe and see, but they cannot smile. The mask's purpose is simple, to make the offender immediately recognizable and, in some cases, unrecognizable as themselves, while letting the whole village mock, lecture, or even ignore them. A mainstream historical fact. Shame masks were used across parts of Europe from the 15th through 17th centuries, often for liars, gossipers, or minor thieves. They were sometimes decorated with inscriptions or symbols indicating the crime. Unlike stocks or collars, these masks could be worn in public for hours or even days, a constant, inescapable branding. You imagine the sensation of wearing one. Your face is hot under the leather. Sweat drips along your temples, smudging the painted features. Every expression is fixed, your own emotions trapped behind the mask. The town laughs, points, and whispers while you can't respond except with gestures or awkward shuffles. A quirky tidbit. In some German towns, shame masks had animal features, long ears for gossipers, snouts for liars, even horns for particularly blasphemous offenders. In one record, a man caught cheating in a dice game was forced to wear a mask with a protruding tongue dangling over his chest. Talk about a permanent reminder of a slip of the tongue. Historians still argue whether these masks genuinely reform behavior or simply turn the punished into public entertainment. Some accounts suggest repeated use led to resignation, while others imply the mask fostered resentment and clever plotting for revenge. Either way, you notice that humiliation had a long shelf life. You trace your hand along the leather of the mask, imagining it cold and stiff in the morning air. A child approaches and tugs on one of the dangling straps, prompting the wearer to stumble. The crowd laughs, a mixture of delight and schadenfreude, and the punishment carries on. Interestingly, shame masks sometimes doubled as moral instruction tools. They were used during town festivals to dramatize vices and illustrate the consequences of wrongdoing. Imagine a public play with no script, one masked citizen representing greed, another dishonesty, everyone else in the audience learning visually how not to behave. It's theater, punishment, and pedagogy rolled into one. You can't resist a small modern joke. Imagine someone live streaming themselves in a shame mask today. Hashtags ready, hashtag regret face, hashtag public shame. The likes would flow, but the humiliation? Eternal. There's also a fringe tidbit that some masks included bells or rattles, so every step jingled, like a walking alarm announcing misbehavior. The effect? An offender's presence was unavoidable, a constant reminder to themselves and to the crowd. One Dutch record mentions a man wearing a mask with a bird beak, accompanied by a tiny bell. He was paraded around the market, his every step musical evidence of guilt. You imagine the sensory assault, smell, sound, and sight converging. The crowd pointing, laughing, whispering. A neighbor giving a scolding glance while a child tugs at your sleeves. The mask ensures you cannot escape observation, cannot hide your shame, cannot even speak your side of the story without drawing attention. It's an intimate form of social theater, cruel in its attention to detail. Some towns also applied masks creatively. Women accused of gossip might wear one during church services. Merchants who cheated in trade fairs could be masked near their stalls. You see a kind of logic, punishment paired with visibility, shame paired with learning. But logic and cruelty are sometimes bedfellows. You look at the mask one last time, running fingers over the ridged iron nose. It seems almost alive, sculpted with malice, yet strangely precise. The air around you thickens, charged with centuries of whispers and laughter. For all its strangeness, the shame mask embodies the medieval obsession with turning personal error into public spectacle. A bell chimes somewhere in the distance, faint but insistent. You can almost imagine the wearer standing in the twilight, every villager's gaze a little heavier than the leather itself. The mask is a reminder. In medieval towns, guilt was never private. It was shared, displayed, paraded, and preserved, sometimes more permanently than the crime itself. You step back, leaving the mask to hang in silent testimony. The alley's shadows deepen, and you feel the weight of all the other punishments lingering in the air. Stocks, stools, barrels, collars. They form a gallery of human ingenuity applied to moral order, each one clever, cruel, and strange in its own way. And as you move onward, you realize that the medieval town's obsession with visibility, spectacle, and shame was not just about punishment, it was about storytelling. Every wrongdoer, every clumsy criminal, every scolded neighbor contributed a chapter. And you, wandering listener, are part of the audience. You leave the mask behind and move toward the market square, now hushed under a blanket of moonlight. The stalls stand abandoned, their wares long packed away, yet the echo of daily life lingers. And there, at the far edge of the square near the Guildhall steps, you notice a new spectacle, the whipping post, grim in its simplicity, yet infinitely dramatic. It's just a stout wooden post with iron rings fastened at waist height. The surface is scarred and weathered, a testament to countless lashes delivered over the years. You step closer, the cold night air brushing your face, and notice the faint grooves in the stone beneath, proof that punishment was never fleeting. Every crack seems to whisper stories of pain, endurance, and public expectation. A mainstream historical fact, whipping posts were widely used in medieval towns across Europe, especially in England, France, and the Low Countries. Their function was straightforward: fasten the culprit, deliver a measured number of lashes, and let the community bear witness. Often, the punishment targeted petty criminals, debtors, or those accused of moral offenses. You imagine standing there, wrists bound, the rough rope chafing your skin. The townsfolk gather, murmuring, some chanting the number of lashes, others offering advice: mind your back, or learn your lesson well. There's an odd rhythm to it, almost ceremonial, as if the act of punishment itself is a type of communal music. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, whipping posts were paired with public confession. The culprit would kneel, recount the offense aloud, and each lash served as punctuation. In York, one record describes a man punished for petty theft, singing a brief song after each stroke, turning the flogging into a bizarre form of medieval karaoke. You shake your head, imagining the grimace and the tune intertwining. Historians still argue whether these punishments achieved moral reform or merely provided collective catharsis. Some suggest that the public nature of the act discouraged future misdeeds. Others argue that the ritual was more about demonstrating authority than teaching lessons. You can almost feel the tension: shame versus obedience, pain versus performance. You glance at the iron rings, imagining a cord snapping across flesh, the sting alternating with gasps, the offender's muscles tightening with every strike. Yet there is also rhythm, almost musical: the swish of rope through the air, the thump against the post, the chorus of murmurs, laughter, and murmured admonishments. It's brutal, yes, but strangely methodical. Some towns even time these punishments to coincide with market days. Not only did the flogged criminal endure pain, but the public bore witness, reinforcing social norms. Merchants paused from their trades, children whispered and pointed, elders nodded solemnly. The entire town participated in this spectacle, and the lesson was amplified through collective observation. A fringe tidbit: in certain records, whipping posts were used in combination with unusual enhancements. One town reportedly added small bells to the rope so that each lash jingled. Another placed a mirror nearby so the offender could watch their own grimace as a form of self-reflection. Medieval ingenuity meets cruelty, or perhaps just dramatic flair. The night air feels heavy as you imagine the scene: moonlight glinting off iron, the smell of sweat and dust, a community witnessing morality enforced in wood and rope. There's no privacy here. Every movement is visible, every cry is heard. The punishment extends beyond the physical. It shapes behavior through public perception, a psychological and social correction intertwined with the corporeal. You can almost hear a medieval joke whispered among the crowd: better watch your coins than your back. Laughter follows, half amused, half nervous. Humor, it seems, was always part of the package, softening the sting, at least for the spectators. After the last lash, the offender stumbles forward, rubbing sore shoulders, shivering under the cold night air. Someone throws a cloak over them. The crowd slowly disperses, murmuring and chuckling, returning to their homes, their chores, their stories. Justice has been served, visible and immediate, leaving memory as the true penalty. You step away, tracing the worn stones beneath the post with your foot. Each groove tells the same story. Punishment is more than pain. It's theater, ritual, and social glue. In medieval towns, whipping posts reminded everyone that misdeeds could never hide. that community eyes were always watching, and that morality was both enforced and performed. And as you leave the square, the post stands silent, shadows stretching long across the cobbles, a sentinel of accountability and a ghostly reminder of the strange ingenuity of justice. You move onward, leaving the square behind, guided by the faint smell of damp hay and smoke drifting from nearby stables. The lane narrows again, and you notice a small, almost unassuming structure tucked against the town wall, a wooden framework topped with a gabled roof. This is the scold's bridle, and it might be the most inventive of all the punishments you've encountered so far. The bridle is cruel in its simplicity. A metal cage designed to fit over the head, it locks around the skull and clamps a flat piece of iron against the tongue, effectively silencing the wearer. Some versions had decorative spikes or inscriptions declaring the wearer a nagger or scold. You reach out and feel the cold iron. It's rigid, unyielding, yet perfectly contoured to hold the head in place. You can almost feel the weight pressing down, the tongue immobilized, the eyes pleading for mercy that won't come. A mainstream historical fact. Scold's bridles were used in England and Scotland from the 16th through 18th centuries, primarily for women accused of gossiping, nagging, or disturbing the social order. They were intended as public humiliation, often worn in the town square for hours or paraded through streets. Sometimes the offender was made to wear the bridle during market days or festivals, combining shame with visibility. You imagine the psychological weight. Not only is your mouth trapped, but your every word, every sigh, every blink is observed by the town. The punishment doesn't just teach restraint, it enforces silence, turning speech itself into a privilege. You can almost feel the fear, the panic, the desire to vanish, trapped behind steel. A quirky tidbit. In some towns, the bridle was adorned with bells, so the wearer jingled with every step. Children laughed, dogs barked, and neighbors whispered jokes. One account mentions a scold paraded past the butcher, who pointed and said, "Finally, a tongue too noisy for the price of meat." Medieval humor, you note, is never subtle. Historians still argue whether scold's bridles were intended purely as moral correction or whether they reflected deeper misogyny. Some scholars see them as enforcement of social norms, while others point to the gendered nature of the punishment, noting that men rarely wore such devices. The discussion is ongoing, and the evidence often feels as sharp as the bridle itself. You imagine being forced to shuffle through the square, head tilted uncomfortably, iron pressing against your tongue. Every step echoes across the cobblestones, every gaze a judgment. There's no privacy, no relief, no escape. Silence becomes a torment as much as the metal itself. A fringe tidbit: in Germany, there was a version called the Katzenkopf, or cat head, which had iron extensions that resembled feline ears and whiskers, making the wearer a living caricature. The idea was that a scold must be mocked into obedience, appearance used as social correction. You can almost hear someone whispering, "Meow," and "repent." You walk past a shuttered tavern and imagine a market day centuries earlier. The bridle's victim is led slowly past the stalls, every step deliberate. Children poke at the metal, adults shake their heads in approval, and the offender endures it all with no way to protest. You shiver. Even imagining it is uncomfortable. Interestingly, some bridles were used in combination with other punishments. A town might pair it with stocks, or a short parade with a cucking stool. The result was cumulative: immobilization, public display, and social commentary all rolled into one. Medieval punishment, it seems, favored layering rather than simplicity. A light joke drifts to your mind. Imagine a medieval influencer reviewing the bridle for fashion. Perfect for silencing in-laws, now available in polished iron finish. You chuckle quietly, knowing it wouldn't be funny if you were wearing it. As night falls fully over the lane, the bridle stands silent, its shadow stretching across the wall. The air is still, almost reverent. The world seems to hold its breath, acknowledging the strange ingenuity and cruelty of a device designed to silence not only words, but defiance itself. You take a deep breath and step away, realizing the bridle is more than metal and leather. It's a symbol of control, the ultimate intersection of ingenuity, fear, and social engineering. And as you leave it behind, you hear the faintest echo of past whispers, trapped forever in iron. You leave the lane and enter a quieter part of town where the streets are narrower, the air cooler, and the cobblestones slick from recent rain. The town feels suspended, caught between centuries, and somewhere ahead, a new kind of punishment waits, one designed not for hands, faces, or tongues, but for the very body itself, the cage. The cage stands in a small courtyard, its iron bars dark and heavy. You can see the faint indentations where chains were once fastened, rusting in silent testimony. It's barely wide enough for a person to stand comfortably, let alone move, twist, or sit. You imagine being locked inside, trapped for hours or sometimes days, with nothing but your own thoughts and the occasional curious passerby tapping on the bars to see if you're still alive. A mainstream historical fact, cages were used in medieval Europe as a form of temporary punishment and public shaming, often for minor criminals, debtors, or individuals who had angered local authorities. They were sometimes placed in town squares or along busy thoroughfares to maximize visibility. Unlike stocks or pillories, cages immobilized the entire body and restricted nearly all movement. You run your fingers along the cold iron bars. They are slick from rain, and the touch is almost alive with history. The sensation is startling. You can almost feel the discomfort that centuries of occupants must have endured. There is no subtlety here. The cage is total, encompassing. A quirky tidbit. Some cages were constructed with extra features to ensure maximum humiliation. In one town in France, cages were slightly elevated, forcing the wearer to balance on tiptoe. In another German record, cages were placed above the street, hanging from a post so everyone passing below could gawk. Imagine the ingenuity, suspension, exposure, and embarrassment all in one. Historians still argue whether cages were used primarily as a form of punishment or as a tool of social theater. Some scholars suggest that the psychological impact of immobilization was as important as the physical restriction. The idea of being trapped, visible, and helpless carried a lesson far beyond any single lash or dunk. You imagine standing inside, feeling the rain seep through gaps in the roof, your fingers clutching the bars, watching the world go on without you. You realize the punishment isn't just for the body, it's for the mind, a prolonged lesson in patience, humility, and fear. A light joke occurs to you. Medieval Airbnb stays include panoramic town views, enforced introspection, and complimentary embarrassment. You chuckle, though it's a nervous sort of laughter, the kind that creeps up when imagining someone confined like this for days. Some cages were used for specific categories of offenses. In one Dutch town, adulterers were confined in a cage outside the chapel during Mass. In another, Debtors were imprisoned publicly until repayment. The logic was consistent. Visibility amplified shame, and shame reinforced order. A fringe tidbit: in a few documented cases, cages were fitted with tiny feeding windows so that neighbors could pass bread or ale to the occupant. This created an odd paradox. The person was punished, but also maintained, a strange blend of cruelty and caretaking. You imagine the awkward gratitude that might inspire. As you stand there, shadows stretching long and thin, you hear the faint echoes of laughter, whispers, and footsteps from centuries past. The cage seems almost sentient, holding memory in its iron bars, the lessons, the fear, the endurance. You step away slowly, letting your hand slide along the rusted metal one last time. Each bar feels like a finger tracing history, like a cautionary note from a world obsessed with visibility and control. The town, silent now, seems to breathe around you, reminding you that ingenuity in punishment can be as intricate as it is cruel. And as you continue along the wet cobbles, you realize that cages, like stocks, collars, and bridles, were more than punishment. They were storytelling. Each device told a story about what a community valued, what it feared, and how it controlled its members, one ingenious, cruel, and unforgettable method at a time. You follow the quiet of the street, letting the memory of cages and collars linger in your mind like shadows on the cobblestones. The town begins to narrow again, and you notice a small sunken pit near the edge of what must once have been a market garden. This is the ducking stool, perhaps the most theatrical of all the medieval punishments you've encountered so far. The wooden contraption is simple but effective. A chair attached to a lever over a pool of water, sometimes a river, sometimes a deep tub. The accused, usually women accused of scolding, gossiping, or minor theft, would be strapped into the seat and plunged repeatedly into the water. You lean close and run a hand along the soaked wood, imagining the chill, the shock, the indignity. A mainstream historical fact. Ducking stools were used from the 16th century into the early 18th century, particularly in England. Their purpose was both correctional and performative, public humiliation paired with physical discomfort. They often appeared near rivers, ensuring that townsfolk could witness the spectacle easily. You imagine being strapped in, water sloshing against your legs, the cold biting, while villagers jeer, point, and throw insults. Each plunge is a punctuation mark of the town's moral code, a reminder that overstepping societal bounds comes with a literal splash. A quirky tidbit: some ducking stools had elaborate wheels or counterweights, making the plunges faster and more theatrical. In one town, the device was fitted with a small bell that rang every time the lever moved, adding a musical cadence to humiliation. You can almost hear it, a bizarre symphony of punishment. Historians still argue whether ducking was intended as reform or purely as entertainment. Some records suggest that repeated duckings did little to change behavior, yet the spectacle reinforced communal norms. And in some cases, townsfolk would cheer so loudly that the embarrassment outweighed the physical discomfort, a curious interplay of pain and social reinforcement. You picture the social choreography. The local constable pulls the lever, water splashes, the crowd murmurs or laughs, and the accused struggles to regain composure. Children peek from behind skirts, dogs bark at the commotion, and merchants pause their trades to watch. It's a performance, a moral lesson, and a public gathering rolled into one. A fringe tidbit. In some records, men were occasionally ducked too, often for quarrelsome behavior or blasphemy. One account describes a man accused of insulting a neighbor's hat, repeatedly dunked while holding a chicken, which is either comic relief or sheer medieval absurdity. You can't decide. The water in the pit glints under the moonlight, inviting yet menacing. You lean closer, imagining the shock of submersion, the taste of cold water on the tongue, the dizzying rise and fall. The mind's memory of humiliation is perhaps sharper than any physical ache. A light joke drifts in. Dunking stools, the original social media, bringing public shaming straight to the square. You laugh softly, picturing a viral tweet centuries before electricity. As you stand back, the wooden frame seems alive with the echoes of countless splashes, gasps, and whispers. The ducking stool is more than wood and iron. It's a symbol of the town's obsession with correcting, controlling, and displaying. Its ingenuity lies in simplicity, its cruelty in repetition, and its humanity in the way the crowd collectively participates, shaping morality through observation. You take one last glance before moving on. The pool of water lies still, moonlight reflecting off its surface, calm now but hiding centuries of indignity beneath. The alley feels colder, quieter, almost respectful, as if acknowledging the strange creativity and ritual of the town's punishments. And as you step away, you sense a pattern emerging. Each device you've encountered, pillory, stocks, drunkard's cloak, collars, masks, cages, bridles, and now the ducking stool, shares a common purpose, not merely to punish, but to narrate, to teach, to impress upon the townspeople that actions carry consequences, sometimes absurd, sometimes severe, but always visible. You continue down the lane, the moon tracing silver along the rooftops, the town whispering its history in shadows, ready to reveal its final peculiar tale. The lane narrows even further, twisting between leaning timber-framed houses whose upper stories almost touch. The night is quiet now, and you notice a faint, circular patch of cobblestones worn smoother than the rest. You kneel slightly to examine it and realize you've arrived at the last of the town's most peculiar punishments, the shame wheel. Unlike anything you've seen before, the wheel is a large wooden structure mounted horizontally on a stout post. Its surface bears notches, scratches, and faded inscriptions, evidence of countless spins over countless years. The idea was simple yet spectacular. An offender would be tied to the wheel and rotated, sometimes exposing them to ridicule, sometimes to the elements, and occasionally to the discomfort of disorientation. Imagine being spun in place while the world around you laughs or gawks, your senses rearranged, your pride suspended in motion. A mainstream historical fact. The shame wheel appears in records from France, Germany, and parts of the Low Countries during the 16th and 17th centuries. It was most often used for minor offenses like cheating at games, quarrelsome behavior, or gossiping. The motion of the wheel, combined with public display, added both physical and psychological pressure. You run your fingers along the edge of the wheel, feeling the roughness of old oak splintering under centuries of use. You imagine being bound, spun, the world tilting in every direction, your hair flying, your stomach churning, and every eye in the village following your motion. It's not painful in the way a whipping or iron collar is, but it's humiliating and exhausting. The wheel combines exposure with vertigo, a subtle but effective lesson in social accountability. A quirky tidbit. In some towns, the wheel was paired with a bell or drum that played during rotation. This turned the punishment into a public spectacle resembling a carnival ride gone wrong. Children laughed, merchants gestured, and neighbors cheered, turning minor offenses into
communal entertainment. One record from Alsace even mentions a particularly inventive town pairing the wheel with a small water sprayer, adding a splash element for extra discomfort.
Historians still argue whether the shame wheel primarily aimed to reform behavior or merely amuse the town. Some scholars suggest the physical disorientation reinforced the offender's sense of vulnerability, making them more likely to conform afterward. Others contend it was largely theatrical, a device to reinforce social cohesion through shared spectacle rather than to teach any lesson. You picture standing there centuries ago, strapped to the wheel, the world tilting wildly, your balance betrayed by gravity and motion. The sensation is dizzying to even imagine. Laughter echoes, blurred by spinning, while your own thoughts struggle to orient themselves. The combination of shame, physical discomfort, and communal observation creates a unique, immersive lesson, a punishment that is lived rather than simply endured. A fringe tidbit. Some accounts suggest that repeat offenders were spun faster or that the wheel could be rotated for longer periods on market days to maximize visibility. In one bizarre account, a man accused of cheating at dice was spun while his fellow players rolled, creating a strange game of skill, shame, and spectacle. Medieval towns were undeniably inventive in their methods of social correction. The wheel, now still in the silver moonlight, seems almost contemplative, as if it remembers the faces it has turned toward the sky, the hands gripping its edges, the gasps of the dizzy and the murmurs of the crowd. You feel the accumulated weight of the town's ingenuity. Every device you've encountered, pillories, stocks, drunkard's cloak, collars, masks, cages, bridles, ducking stools, and now this wheel, represents centuries of thought on human behavior, morality, and control. You stand in silence for a moment, feeling the night wrap around you, and you realize the common thread in all these punishments: visibility. Every contraption demands that the community see and remember the offender. Pain, embarrassment, and ingenuity intertwine to create lessons not just for the punished, but for everyone who witnesses. The town becomes a theater, morality the script, and history the echoing audience. You start walking back through the twisting lanes, past the flickering lanterns, past the shadows of houses and alleys. The town breathes around you, alive with stories of ingenuity and peculiar justice. The sound of distant wind whispers through the timber, carrying hints of laughter, scolding, and the occasional splash. Reminders that human curiosity and creativity have always found ways to leave their mark. And as you step onto the final stretch of cobblestones leading out of town, the night feels softer, quieter, almost reverent. You carry with you the memory of all these strange contraptions, not just as instruments of punishment, but as testament to human imagination, our desire to teach, correct, and observe. The medieval town fades behind you, but its peculiar ingenuity lingers, settling gently in your mind like the last notes of a long-forgotten song. Now, as you let your pace slow and the town's memory recedes into shadow, breathe deeply. Feel the cool night air brushing your cheeks, soft and calming after the weight of so many centuries of strange justice. The echoes of drums, chains, water splashes, and murmured admonishments fade into a quiet hum, like the town itself, exhaling, finally at rest. Imagine each device, the stocks, the collars, the barrels, the cages, and the wheels, melting softly into the cobblestones, their lessons settling like gentle dust. You carry the stories with you, but they no longer sting. Each one becomes a small vignette of ingenuity, human curiosity, and the effort to shape behavior in a complex world. Even the crueler inventions hold a subtle rhythm, a whisper of community, ritual, and shared understanding. Feel your shoulders relax as the memory of public shaming, metal restraints, and plunging water turns into something softer. The hum of history, steady and gentle. You are no longer bound, no longer exposed, no longer spinning or struggling. Simply a witness, walking quietly through the lanes of imagination. The moonlight above settles into a calm silver glow, casting long, forgiving shadows. Every whispered admonishment and ironic joke, every splash of water and clink of iron, drifts into the past. They become stories tucked safely into the folds of memory, softening as they travel forward. You trudge now toward your own comfort, the echoing town behind you a gentle lullaby. Let the last image of moonlit cobblestones, worn wood, and cold iron dissolve. The weight of medieval ingenuity and peculiar punishments slips away, leaving only the slow, quiet hum of history and imagination. And in this softened silence, you feel it, a gentle reassurance that the world, in all its peculiarities, continues to move, breathe, and whisper.